meat of what we're talking about, which is, I think, certain classes of primarily bougie upper middle class people and technocrats, some of whom might even want to brand themselves as left or progressive, desperately searching for straws to vote for a radically less progressive candidate when the most progressive candidate in modern American history could actually become president. What is the case, and why is it such an easy, simple, why are we even talking about this case for Bernie Sanders over Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned in the segment that I did on this the other day, if you have a worldview that's a democratic socialist worldview or a social democratic worldview, this is really an empirical question. This isn't like, what flavor of bagel do you like? This right. is, square peg, round hole stuff. If you're trying to say Elizabeth Warren is equal to or better than Bernie on this stuff, it's just not true. So for one thing, she voted for Ben Carson to be the head of housing and urban development. Now, thankfully, in the second round of voting, she flipped because of a massive backlash. However, we don't want to have to babysit the person who's going to be our president. We want them to be on our side, and we know they're going to be on our side. And in the case of Elizabeth Warren, every now and then she drops a bomb on us where we're like, why did you just do that? That makes less than no sense. And it shows that she doesn't have the same political intuition as Bernie, or she might have decent political intuition, but she could easily get talked out of those positions, which are good. She also, of course, Bernie also wants to eliminate all student loan debt, and Elizabeth Warren doesn't. Bernie wants to eliminate all medical debt, and she doesn't. And one of the biggest things to me that really stuck with me is she told Cenk in an interview, quote, "Allow me to make a spirited defense of Joe Manchin." And right. So that's all I really need to know, because what you understand and what I understand and what people who follow this closely understand is we need a president who's not only willing to take on the Republicans, but a president who's also willing to stand up to the Democrats and either make them fall in line or even go as far as rallying against them in their own states and supporting primary challengers against them. And I asked that question point blank to Bernie, and he said, absolutely, I'll support primaries against. Without pause.
Without pause.
That is fundamentally not Elizabeth Warren. She is a team player, and she even goes as far as to obfuscate all the other Democratic healthcare plans and Medicare for all. She makes it seem like, well, a public option and Medicare for all extra and Medicare for America and all these things. The core of it is the same. And the core of it is, we want to get more people health care. And she doesn't understand that, or it's cynical and she does get it, but she doesn't care that, all the other plans except the Bernie bill and the Jayapal bill are to one extent or another gaslighting to protect the status quo and protect the profits of the for-profit health insurance companies.
100%.
And she's simply, that's not the spectrum that she thinks is reasonable. She's more than willing to entertain the idea that a lot of these very open half measures are serious, and they're just not. And then there's also, apart from the substantive stuff, there's also real stylistic concerns in terms of electability.
Definitely.
So, I'm actually relatively agnostic on the question as to whether or not Elizabeth Warren would be able to beat Trump. But I do know this. We're not in a professorial political age. And that's what she is. She's a wonky technocrat. And, it's a street fighter, brawler, populist age right now. And that's what's landing. That's what we know is landing with the electorate. And when you have a candidate who's not only further left substantively, but is also stylistically hitting the nail on the head for today's political era, there's really no conceivable reason to think that Elizabeth Warren comes remotely near Bernie.
100%. And I just want to add two things. And one, I want to do, this is way less important, but a touch of a mea culpa, right? Because I'm starting to see echoes of the Democratic, the DNC leadership race between Keith Ellison and Tom Perez in the following way. That you had Ellison after 2016, you had someone with legit progressive credentials who put his hat in the ring. And if you recall at that time, even Chuck Schumer backed him, right? There was some recognition amongst, even the most mediocre and venile like Chuck Schumer that we need to at least, pivot on branding. I've no doubt that it's not substantive in his case. That's obvious. And then the Obama team basically like behind the scenes kind of, and there was actually ended up being a lot of really disgusting dealings with the Puerto Rican delegation, which people should look into. It's another story, but it's a really important one. And Tom Perez gets elected. And I have to confess to something here, because partially because in some ways I really am to the left in terms of, having a pretty Marxist analytic perspective of most of these things. Sometimes I actually, and in this case, I was softer on the establishment than I should have been, which is I 100% supported Keith Ellison. But I was like, well, that's interesting because Tom Perez is like, he's another mediocre establishment hack, but he's a liberal one, right? And again, before people freak out, I'm not comparing. Obviously, Warren's an infinitely more impressive and better everything than Tom Perez. But the dynamic stands, which is that there is a progressive groundswell of momentum for an actual transformative agenda, which translates concretely to threatening incumbent interests inside the Democratic Party, donors, consultants, and candidates. And now Biden becomes, potentially implausible. I always like to remind people the whole thing has been a disaster for months. He still leads in the polls, which people should remind themselves of occasionally. And, okay, let's circle around Elizabeth Warren, who will assure the establishment and assure all the incumbent interests, and then they can, take care of their real enemy, which is Bernie. And I'll just say, continuing the case study, Tom Perez has been an absolute disaster. You need to uproot these things fundamentally.
Yeah. I mean, the good news, though, is that at least we're shifting the Overton window.
Right. But
the bad news is they have 1,000 tricks up their sleeve. And this actually reminds me of something that happened years ago so there's this real groundswell for, doing something on the issue of corruption and money in politics. And Jenks Wolfpack, for example, they had, a really strong amendment on that they were pushing for. And what's interesting is when there's enough noise, you do get a reaction from Congress, but their reaction is to say, oh, no, totally, we're with you. And then what they do is they propose a watered down piece of legislation that basically says like, okay, we need to go back to prior to Citizens United.
Right.
But what people don't recognize is Citizens United is not the only problem. Citizens United shot a dead horse. We have case law going back to like the 1970s, where the Supreme Court slowly but surely ruled in a variety of cases that effectively money equals free speech. So what's interesting is they'll try to harness that grassroots pressure and then redirect it in a way that's more palatable to their concerns. And that's exactly what we're seeing with Elizabeth Warren. Because if you had told me before this election cycle that, hey, Kyle, she's going to get wildly positive press, I would have said there's no way that's true. Right. There's no way she's going to get positive press. But I think there's this recognition that, okay, basically anybody but Bernie is going to be, palatable to them. So why not prop her up as the alternative and then pretend like, scold all the Bernie bros and say like, well, if you don't accept her, you're obviously just sexist. Right.
We'll play that same game again. I think, and again, right. We can't even get into that nonsense. But I think that, that's exactly right. And I think, it's very revealing. And last summer or last winter, really, the quotes from Wall Street people and profiles would say we're open to anybody besides Sanders or Warren. And now it's we need to stop Bernie Sanders.
That's right. It's morphed. You're so right.
And I just also want to add, and obviously I hit this a lot, but this is coming on the heels of a new, Council on Foreign Relations questionnaire, which I'm actually writing a piece on currently with Ben Burgess.
And I'll be covering that too, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, look, you're talking about, look, I don't even need to, we don't even need to use, hyperbole here. It's just like you said, when we were talking before we went on, totally conventional democratic foreign policy. Now, if you are somebody who claims any kind of international solidarity or progressive impulse, conventional democratic foreign policy is a catastrophe for human beings across the planet. So we're talking the same dead rhetoric on Venezuela. We're talking, yes, maybe I'll kind of wokeify the language on the Palestinians, but obviously we're never going to do. And look, there's one thing short of BDS, but that is actually remotely plausible for a presidential candidate to talk about, which is withholding aid. Bernie's put it on the table. Warren's never going to do it. There's nothing on Latin America. There's nothing on debt relief. There's, yes, withdraw from Afghanistan, which sounds good, but still a lot of rhetoric about securing our interests. And frankly, even if it's just as simple as there's no interest and no focus, well, all of the same retreads. That's how Samantha Power becomes Secretary of State. And we have another 4 years of catastrophic interventionist foreign policy.
Well, I just learned this the other day, but apparently Elizabeth Warren had spoken about Madeleine Albright being a close advisor to her on these issues.
Disaster.
She, quite literally said the death of 500,000 Iraqi civilians was okay.
A price we're comfortable paying, to paraphrase her. And also in the Council on Foreign Relations questionnaire, she renewed support of the Iran deal, but used rhetoric suggesting that the Iranians were at fault in ruining the deal. Now, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, that's what did you say? Like, that's squares and holes. Like, that is objectively false. Like, the United States ruined that agreement. The Iranians followed it, period.
That's right. And the scary thing is, because I remember our last conversation, we spoke about socialist internationalism versus left isolation.
Right.
And she doesn't even hit the bar of left isolation.
Not at all.
Which is stunning, because domestically, I do think, and I kind of get a little frustrated when people don't give her due on issues involving Wall Street, on issues involving trade and taxation.
Absolutely. She's good.
I think she's very solid on those issues.
She's good on those issues. It's silly to pretend otherwise.
Is the foreign policy is just not even in the same galaxy.
I mean, yeah, and all I could say is, and one of the things I appreciate about you cover foreign policy a lot too, and I would just say, like, that's something that I'm just going to assert. If you're voting in the United States, you have to, especially if you're going to kind of consider yourself to be, a conscientious person voting, it really is like the ultimate narcissism to not factor that into your vote. And these are galaxies apart. I mean, and then even on the flip side, like, what is the difference between a global plan to deal with the climate crisis, which of course is a global crisis that involves technology transfer and joint investment with China and Russia as well as developing countries, which is essential, versus Thomas Friedman style eco-military?
Yeah. And another thing, a point that's rarely made, is that it's true that the area where the president has the most influence is on foreign policy. Like, you can get the most done because you're the commander in chief. So that's what you can impact the most, and that's the area where she's totally lacking. And by the way, we should mention Bernie has improved since 2016.
Significantly.